This is a story that I came across in a collection called Popular Tales of the West Highlands, published back in 1860 something um, by J.F. Campbell in Edinburgh. But it has the feel of a very, very old story. It's full of inconsistencies and cruelties and strangeness that seem to have bubbled up out of the collective unconscious. This is the story of the Battle of the Birds. And long, long ago, when the earth was but young, all the birds and all the beasts used to gather together every year for a great battle to decide who would be king of the birds and the beasts. Now, the son of a king decided he would go and observe the battle and report back to his father who that king would be. And he travelled for many, many days to get to the battle. When he got there, the battle was over, all apart from one contest between a serpent and a great black raven. And they had been fighting for many hours. And the raven was losing the contest until the king's son struck the serpent with his staff and took its head off. And the raven emerged victorious. Now the raven was grateful. And he turned to the king's son and he said, "Climb to the space between my wings." And the king's son did that, and the raven took to the sky. And he'd been flying for some time, and the raven said, "Do you see that house yonder?" Now, the king's son could see a house, and it was far, far distant. But though it was far distant, they were there very, very quickly. And the raven said, "This is the house of my sister, and you will be made welcome here." And he was made welcome. And he ate the finest of meats and drank the finest of drinks. And he was given the softest of beds for his bag. And the following day, again the raven said, "Climb to the space between my wings." And the great raven took to the sky and flew across 7 mountains and 7 lochs and 7 moors to another little house. And the same again. The king's son ate the best of meats and drank the best of drink and was given a soft bed for his back. But the following day, when the king's son looked for the raven, he couldn't find him. But he did find a fair youth. And he said to that fair youth, "Have you seen a great black raven?" And the youth said, "You will never see that raven again, for I am that raven. I was under an enchantment, and you freed me from that enchantment when you struck off the serpent's head." And then the fair youth produced a parcel, and he handed it to the king's son, and he said, "Travel back on the path that we took, but never look inside this parcel until you reach that place which you would most love to make your home." Now the king's son knew immediately what that place was. It was a little valley, a little hollow directly opposite his father's castle, surrounded by trees. So he set back off on his journey, and he travelled across the 7 mountains and the 7 lochs and the 7 moors, and he came to the house the Raven's sister, and he was made welcome. And he ate the best of meats and drank the best of drinks, and he was given a soft bed for his back. And then he continued his journey, and he came to a great wood which he knew was near his father's kingdom. But this was a dark wood, a foreboding place. Now the king's son was tired, so he stopped to rest. And curiosity overcame him, and he looked in that parcel. And no sooner had he opened the parcel than before him he saw a great castle with an orchard and a beautiful crystal clear stream running through it. And he knew why the raven had told him not to look in the parcel until he reached that special place. And now his beautiful home was in the middle of this foreboding forest. But just then he heard a great crashing sound, and the earth shook, and he turned to see a giant approaching. And the giant looked at him and said, "This is no place to make your home." King's son said, "This is not where I intended my home to be." And he explained what happened when he opened the parcel. And the giant said, "Well, what will you give me if I put this castle and this orchard and this stream back in that parcel for you?" And the king's son said, "Well, what would be your price?" And the giant said, "When your first son reaches 7 years of age, you will give him to me." Now this seemed to be a far distant thing for the king's son, so he agreed. Sure enough, the giant replaced the castle and the orchard and the stream into the parcel. And he said, "Now you be on your way, and I will be on my way. But do not forget your promise." Now when the king's son reached that hollow opposite his father's castle, he opened a parcel, and there before him stood a great castle of his own with an orchard and a crystal clear stream. And when he opened the door of the castle, there was a fair maiden there, and she said, "All of this is yours if you will marry me tonight." And that the king's son did. Now 7 years came and went, and the king's son had a son. And on the day of his 7th birthday, the earth began to shake. And the king's son knew that the giant approached. Now he hadn't mentioned his promise to his wife. And when he did, she said, "Leave this matter to me. Go and greet the giant." So the king's son went out and greeted the giant. The giant said, "It is time. Give me your son. Remember your promise." Meanwhile, the king's son's wife went to the kitchen, and she found the son of the cook, who was the same age as her own son, and she dressed him in royal garments, and she took him out, and she gave him to the giant. And the giant left. Now when the giant came to his own home, he said to the boy, "Take this rod." And he gave this great rod to the boy, and he said, "What would your father do with this rod?" And the boy said, "Well, my father would take this rod and he would beat the cats and the dogs who tried to eat king's meat." "You are no prince," said the giant. "You are the son of a cook." And with that, he picked up the boy and he dashed him against the rocks. And he stormed back to the castle. And he demanded the son of the prince. And the prince's wife went to the butler's son, who was the same age as her own son, and she dressed him in royal garments. And she gave him to the giant, and the giant took him back to his own home. And again he said, "What would your father do with this rod?" And the boy said, "My father would beat the cats and dogs who tried to eat from the king's table." The giant said, "You are not the prince's son. You are the son of a butler." And again he dashed the boy against the rocks. And when he returned to the castle, he said, "Bring out your son." And this time, they had no choice. They had to bring out the son. And the giant took the son back to his own castle, and he raised him as if he was his own son. Now, when he came of age, the giant wanted the son to marry one of his two eldest daughters. But one evening, when the giant was out, this young prince heard the most beautiful singing coming from a high tower in the castle, and he made his way up there and he found the giant's youngest daughter, and he loved her and she loved him. But she said, "My father will marry you to one of my sisters. You must say no, and you must ask for my hand." The next day, the giant brought the prince, and he stood him in front of the two daughters, the two eldest daughters, and he said, "I would that you marry one of my daughters." And the prince said, "I will marry one of your daughters." But then he turned and he pointed to the youngest daughter. He said, "I will marry this daughter." The giant was furious because he felt he had been tricked. And he said, "Okay, you can marry my daughter, but I have 3 tasks that you must complete first." And the first task, he took the prince to a great byre, a great cowshed. And he said, "This byre is covered with the dung of 100 cows. And it has never been cleaned for 7 years. By midday tomorrow, it must be so clean that a golden apple could roll with ease from one end to the other." And the giant went off back to the castle and left the prince to complete the task, which he set about with great energy. But it was such a difficult task. It was impossible. It was like emptying the ocean with a bucket. And he soon became exhausted. And in the midday heat, he was sweating and exhausted, and his muscles ached. But then the giant's daughter arrived. She said, "You are so exhausted. Rest." Now, the prince knew that if he didn't complete the task, not only would he not marry the giant's daughter, but the giant had promised that he would have the prince's blood for his drink if he did not complete this task. So he said to the giant's daughter, "It's death that awaits me anyway, so I may as well rest." And he lay down by a tree, and he was soon fast asleep. When he awoke, the giant's daughter was gone, and the byre was spotlessly clean. And just then the giant arrived with a great golden apple, and he rolled that apple through the byre, and it rolled straight through and out the other side. And the giant said, "You have cleaned the byre." And the prince said, "I have cleaned the byre." And the giant said, "Someone has cleaned the byre." And the prince said, "Well, it was not you who cleaned the byre." And the giant said, "You have until midday tomorrow to thatch the roof of this byre, and you must thatch it with the feathers of birds, and no two of those birds shall be of the same colour." Now the prince set to his task. He took his bow and his quiver, and he set out on the moor to find birds, and it was a difficult, difficult task. And after many, many hours, he slumped exhausted, which is when the giant's daughter turned up and said, "You must rest." And the prince said, "It's an impossible task. It's death that awaits me anyway. I may as well rest." And he was soon fast asleep. And when he awoke, there was no sign of the giant's daughter, but the roof of the byre was thatched perfectly with the feathers of birds, and no two of those birds was of the same colour. When the giant arrived and said, "You have thatched the byre," and the prince said, "I have thatched the byre," and the giant said, "Someone has thatched the byre." And the prince said, "Well, it was not you who thatched the byre." The giant was furious. He said, "Your final task. There is a tree by the great loch, and on the top of that tree there is a magpie's nest. Bring me 5 eggs from that nest for my breakfast, but not one of them shall be cracked or broken." Now, it was not difficult for the prince to find the tree, because it stood out above all the trees of the forest. And from the foot of the tree to its first branch was 500 feet. And he tried and he tried and he tried to climb to that first branch, but he could not get there. He kept slipping back down the tree until the skin of his hands was torn and raw. And that's when the giant's daughter arrived. She took her fingers and she made of her fingers a ladder for the prince, and he climbed to the top of the tree. And he got the 5 eggs and he climbed back down. But then the giant's daughter said, I can feel my father's breath burning on my back. We must be quick. And with that, she gathered together her fingers again. But she was in such a rush that she left one of the fingers high on the tree. But the giant had his eggs for his breakfast, and he knew that he must agree to the marriage. So he said, tomorrow you shall be married. And then, after the marriage, when the celebrations are over, you shall choose your bride, select your bride, pick her out, and you will go to your rest.